Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, Black Women in the ERA with Dr. Mary Phillips. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 30 to 40 minute presentation and then she'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. And feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them to Dr. Phillips at the end of the presentation. Dr. Mary Phillips teaches in the Department of Africana Studies at Lehman College, City University of New York. Over to you, Dr. Phillips.
All right, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment this evening. I am gonna first go ahead and share my screen with everyone first. All right, okay. So I think this is a really important conversation to have in the context of the global pandemic and ongoing state violence against Black and Brown communities. So I want to begin my talk by first explaining what exactly the Equal Rights Amendment is for those who may not know. The Equal Rights Amendment is an amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee equal citizenship under the law to women on the basis of sex. It will offer gender equality in the Constitution. The ERA emerged out of the suffragist movement, which was born out of the abolitionist movement. In 1923, suffragist movement activists, most notably Alice Paul, wrote the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced at the 75th anniversary of the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls and in Congress roughly 4 months later. It's important to note that Alice Paul was racist, like many white women suffragists. The Equal Rights Amendment gained momentum from the successful campaign for the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which grants white women the right to vote. The suffrage movement would not have been successful without Black women, even though they do not reap the benefits of the 19th Amendment. Black women, including those of Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Mary McLeod Bethune, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Ida B. Wells, to name a few, as well as institutions such as the Black Women's Club movement and the National Association of Colored Women, have been instrumental to women's suffrage. What I am saying is that Black women were indeed foundational to the creation of the Equal Rights Amendment. The precedent set by Black women set the stage for all women. The first draft of the Equal Rights Amendment reads as follows. Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. In 1943, Alice Paul revised the Equal Rights Amendment to engage the pros of both the 19th and the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment granted Black men the right to vote. The revised version reads as follows. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Over 48 years after the ERA's initial introduction, it finally made it through Congress in 1972. With this came a 7-year timeline imposed in a clause by Congress for the required 38 state ratification. That year, 22 states ratified the ERA. With mounting criticisms by the likes of Phyllis Schlafly, support for the ERA decelerated, which led to only 8 ratifications in 1973, 3 in 1974, 1 in 1975, and none in 1976. The next year, less than 40 states had ratified the ERA. In 1978, the timeline was extended to 1982. When the deadline approached on June 30th, 1982, the ERA was actually short 3 states for its ratification to be granted. 14 days later, the ERA bill was reintroduced in Congress and continued to be reintroduced before every session since 1982. In 2013, slight language was added to the ERA, most notably the word women. Women was added in section 1 of the amendment. It changed the language to, quote, women shall have equal rights in the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by an account of sex, end quote. This change marked the only place where women are mentioned in the Constitution. The continuous battle regarding the ERA speaks to the ways in which patriarchy is embedded in the social fabric of America. With the Constitution holding no value for women, women are legally classified as second-class citizens. The 2016 election of Donald Trump and the 2017 Women's March, the Me Too and Time's Up movement ignited renewed interest in the ERA. This same year, Nevada ratified the ERA. And in 2018, we saw an increase of 20% of women in Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And Illinois ratified the ERA. Last year, almost 100 years after its initial introduction of the ERA in Congress, Virginia became the 38th and final state to ratify the ERA under the leadership of Jennifer Carroll Foy, who would have become the first woman elected governor of Virginia and the first Black woman governor nationally if she would have won. With Virginia's ratification, the House of Representatives voted to eradicate the time limitations of the ERA, which was supported by Black women politicians. It is important to note that even with Virginia's ratification, the ERA is not officially part of the Constitution today. The long battle for the proposed Equal Rights Amendment has to do with patriarchy and misogyny. White men primarily make up Congress, and only 10 women served in the Senate from 1922 to 1970, with only 2 serving at a time. Jennifer Foy was part of a long tradition of Black women's activism in support of the ERA. It is indeed a myth that Black women were not in support of the ERA. Historically, Black women have used the law to their advantage. Black women have been critical in the fight for women's rights. The ERA would allow women legal recourse and protection under the law. As Shirley Chisholm echoed in her 1970 speech, quote, federal agencies and institutions responsible for the enforcement of equal opportunity laws need the authority of a constitutional amendment, end quote. In discussing the ways Black women would benefit from the ERA, it is critical to turn to the topic of intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term coined by legal scholar and lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw. It is the idea that we have multiple identities based on our race, class, and gender that shape our everyday lives. You cannot separate your race from your gender. Our race and our gender shape how we are treated and how people interact with us. Discourses tend to recognize race through the prism of Black male experiences and women through the lens of whiteness. Consequently, Black women's experiences and voices are often erased or placed at the margins. Intersectionality indeed offers us a framing to see how sexism and racism overlap simultaneously to create multiple forms of oppression for women of color. In a TED Talk on intersectionality that is available on YouTube, Crenshaw gives the example of a Black working mother who experienced race and gender discrimination at her place of employment. She claimed the automobile assembly plant refused to hire her based on her identity as a Black woman. The judge dismissed her case on the basis that the company did hire African Americans and women, but the court refused to acknowledge that African Americans hired were only men and women hired were exclusively white. The court was unable to see the ways that she was discriminated by the multiple forces of race and gender. Thus, she had no legal recourse. Intersectionality broadens the frame to include Black and other women of color, allowing us to better see the cracks in the law. While Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, it's actually not a new analytic within the lives of women of color. She explains, and I quote, "In every generation and in every intellectual sphere and in every political moment, there have been African American women who have articulated the need to think and talk about race through a lens that looks at gender, or think and talk about feminism through a lens that looks at race." So this is in continuity with that. She was building on a long history of activism from Black women and women of color in support of women's rights and the ERA. The advocacy by Black and brown women has always been intersectional. I will now turn to snapshots of Black women who have been fundamental to the history of women's rights and the ERA. One of the earliest articulations of intersectionality and women's rights in the mid-19th century is most notably from abolitionist Sojourner Truth. In her 1851 speech, "Aren't I a Woman?" Her speech set the precedent for women's rights and that she articulated the realities of enslaved women. She talked about what it means to be doubly oppressed as a result of your race and gender, and emphasized the direct connections between abolition, women's equality, and the quest to eradicate racism and white supremacy. As an anti-lynching crusader, journalist, and an advocate of women's suffrage, Ida B. Wells made public the state and vigilante systematic violence occurring through the lynching of Black men and women. The fight against racialized violence is deeply connected to equal citizenship. In 1913, Wells was forced to march in the back of the first suffrage parade with other women of color in Washington, D.C. She refused and marched alongside the delegation in Illinois. Civil rights lawyer and women's rights activist, Paulie Murray, who later became a priest, in 1965, became the first Black person to receive a law degree from Yale Law School. She was a fierce advocate of women's rights. In 1961, John F. Kennedy appointed her to the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. She criticized sexism within the civil rights movement, and in 1970, she supported the Equal Rights Amendment at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings, arguing that Black women have the most to gain from the adoption of the Equal Rights Movement. Like those before her, she spoke about intersectionality long before the term was used, using her life history to demonstrate the multiple oppressions Black women encounter on a daily basis. She discussed how opponents feared women having power over their lives. In her own words, she stated, quote, "The adoption of the Equal Rights Amendment and its ratification by several states could well usher in an unprecedented golden age of human relations in our national life and help our country to become an example of the practical ideal that the sole purpose of governments is to create the conditions under which the uniqueness of each individual is cherished and is encouraged to fulfill his or her creative potential." In 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first Black woman elected to Congress. She ran for president in 1972, becoming the first Black woman to do so. She served 7 terms in the House of Representatives, introducing 50 pieces of legislation, including that of the Equal Rights Amendment. In her 1970 speech in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, she declared, quote, "When men and women are prevented from recognizing one another's humanity by sexual prejudices, nourished by legal as well as social institutions, society as a whole remains less than it could otherwise become," end quote. Her words ring true today. Feminist lawyer and political activist, and I get so excited talking about Florence Kennedy. Most known for her eccentric style, she was a force to be reckoned with in the feminist movement. She graduated from Columbia Law School in 1951, but was initially denied admission on the basis of her sex. In 1966, she co-founded the National Organization for Women, but eventually cut ties with the group and founded the Feminist Party as a vehicle to nominate Shirley Chisholm for the 1972 presidential run. She went on to participate in the 1967 Atlantic City Miss America protest. In her 1976 appearance on the show Say Brother, she talks about how the ERA would be, quote, "a victory over white ring sexist racism," end quote. She also pointed out the profound racism in the feminist movement, as well as the compounding factors of racism and sexism of the media and the Stop ERA movement. She was a proponent of the Black Panther Party and legally represented Panthers, including H. Rap Brown and Assata Shakur. The Black Panther Party, one of the most well-known organizations during the Black Power movement. It functioned as a grassroots political building organization founded in Oakland, California in 1966. The organization existed for 16 years, serving Black and poor communities on the national and international level. Women were involved in all aspects of the party's activities and community programs. These programs sustained local communities through the availability and accessibility of basic resources such as food, material goods, education, healthcare, employment, and legal and housing services. Gender politics was fluid and did not look the same across all chapters and branches. But the organization was consistently engaged in internal debates on the topic of gender and womanhood. During the women's liberation movement, the Panthers covered issues such as reproductive rights, sexuality, gender bias, feminism, and state violence against women. In the early 70s, they discussed feminism as relevant to the lives of Black women in the Panther newspaper. They publicly supported the Equal Rights Amendment. And I want to read an excerpt from their 1980 editorial on the ERA in the Panther newspaper, because most actually do not know that the Panthers were in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. And they wrote, "Here in America, the most advanced technological society in the world, we are still in the dark ages as far as women's rights are concerned. The Equal Rights Amendment, which would guarantee US women full equality under the Constitution, has met some of the stiffest opposition from women whose views of themselves and their role in society has been distorted by a culture which still subtly teaches that women are the weaker sex. Poor and oppressed women in America and elsewhere in the world have always viewed their struggle for equality as part of the overall struggle for poor people and freedom. They have well understood that no society can be free unless all of its people are treated equally." In 2019, Kimberly Crenshaw and Catherine McKinnon revised the language of the Equal Rights Amendment to entrench the importance of diversity. Published in the Yale Law Journal, Section 1 reads as follows: "Women in all their diversity shall have equal rights in the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction." This language change was important to address intersectional issues as it affects women of color today. Within the last decade, a new generation of activists are reclaiming the Equal Rights Amendment in their quest to combat police brutality and oppression on communities of color. As the founders of Black Lives Matter, they articulate in their praxis gender equity as fundamental to Black lives. Due to patriarchy, cases of Black and brown women lynched by the state often don't become high-profile cases. The stories are silenced and placed on the margins. The African American Policy Forum started the hashtag Say Her Name in 2015 to bring visibility to the violence of BIPOC women and anti-Black violence. The Equal Rights Amendment would allow women not only full citizenship under the law on the basis of sex, but would arm women with legal recourse to challenge inequities on the basis of sex and gender. Black women would benefit from this legislation in numerous ways. It is a myth that Black women have already won equality. We are lagging behind our counterparts throughout the world as it relates to women in political positions. In the United States, 20% of women are represented in political positions, when in many other countries, women represent 50% of the political leadership. Some countries also ensure women are represented in political offices through the use of equality provisions. The pay gap is alarming and works to the benefit of white male laborers. Women of color experience intersectional oppression, which contributes to the wealth gap impacted by the period of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and structural barriers such as redlining. Black women make less than men and have historically participated in the workforce at higher rates than the majority of women. The Equal Rights Amendment would address unemployment, voting disenfranchisement, unequal pay practices, and a host of other oppressions experienced by Black women. Black mothers experience workplace discrimination, structural barriers, and implicit bias in the workplace. They are treated as disposable. Stereotypes are written on their bodies as well as those of all women of color. The Equal Rights Amendment will be a step in the right direction to challenge what Bell Hooks calls, quote, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. It will work against laws that fail to protect Black women and allow full access socially, politically, and economically. It will be a move toward the fight for mothers to get paid leave, affordable quality healthcare and after-school programs, paid sick days, fair pay, and flexible work arrangements. It will provide more balance between the sexes and enable federal policies that allow fathers to benefit and exercise their right to parental leave without judgment or backlash. It would mend the legal loopholes regarding gender and racial discrimination and provide equitable resources. When there is an offense against women's bodies, the Equal Rights Amendment will serve as a systemic tool for protection. COVID adversely impacted Black and Brown communities. In the pandemic, Black and Brown women are disproportionately in the position as low-wage frontline workers, which places them in great danger. Healthcare inequities leave many Black and Brown women unprotected. COVID amplified systems of patriarchy. There was an increasing number of women impacted by domestic violence, and funding for domestic violence shelters actually decreased. The Equal Rights Amendment would serve as a tool to also protect women prisoners subjected to abuse and various forms of discrimination. As I have outlined in my talk today, I have really made clear the ways in which Black women have actually been critical, have been integral to political progress. We need continued advocacy from all to keep pushing in the fight for the constitutional ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. Thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. That was great. It was such a great historical view of the whole movement. We do have a couple of questions. Hang on. Here we go. One question that I have has to do with the LGBTQ movement and how that impacts the ERA movement, you know, how it either strengthens or doesn't, given what's going on in our politics today. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. You know, the equal rights movement, you know, it definitely strengthens the LG or issues relevant to the LGBT community. There are a host of issues when we talk about the LGBT community. I mean, most people talk about same-sex marriage, you know, but there's so many others, such as, you know, discrimination in the workplace, you know, losing your job, you know, because of how you identify. You know, I even think about young children, school-aged children getting bullied because of how they identify. I think of the poverty rate among young Black and brown children. All of this would you know, be addressed with the ratification of the equal rights movement. It will work towards, so, you know, I think a lot about how we envision a world that provides equal access for everyone, right? I mean, men already have this kind of equal access, whereas women don't. And so it would certainly benefit those in the LGBT community, when we look at all of those particular kinds of concerns that impact their everyday lives, that doesn't always make it to the mainstream. I'm also thinking about healthcare disparities, and how those in the LGBT community are very much impacted by that.
And are the movements working together? Sort of are the advocates in both the ERA movement and the LGBTQ movement, are they working together on the ERA?
But there's always coalitions on the ground. There's always coalitions that are happening, that are working in service. You know, when I think of Jennifer Carroll Foy, when I think of, you know, all of the leadership that was put in place to get, you know, the ratification of the states, you know, that have occurred, it was due to coalition building. None of these movements happen without the formation of coalitions. So absolutely, also being driven by the youth as well. Yes.
Great. Here's a question for you. Didn't a judge rule that the final states had signed on too late, so that we would have to start over at this terrible time when the GOP and far right positions echo the backlash against the ERA in the 70s?
Yes, and to that question, that's absolutely right. That did recently happen. But it's also an ongoing conversation. Many folks have argued that equality doesn't have a time limit as well, right? And so I know that there is work being done on the ground to push back against that, as you know, against that as well. You see the grassroots political activism, you see the activism happening in political sectors. And so it's a current debate, and people, and they're having that conversation. But yes, absolutely. But I want to also think about the full context of what has come from that judge saying that as well.
So that's not the final word?
No.
Okay.
Not from my understanding. I'm a historian. I'm not a political scientist, but from my understanding, no, that's not the final word.
Okay. Okay. I have a couple nuts and bolts questions for you. Can you talk about would the ERA adversely affect existing benefits and protections that women now receive? For example, alimony or child custody or Social Security payments, because I know those have been used as arguments against ratification.
Yeah, yeah. And so I suspect with every grain, there tends to be pushback on special provisions because it would be a law that women are equal, which means that some people may actually find ways to misuse the law. And so, in that regard, I would absolutely say that could happen because of the misuses of the law that occur from, legislation that comes into place like this.
Okay. And do you have a sense of how the ERA would affect women in the military?
Yes, yes. And so, the issues that happen in the military, and some of the kind of advocacy that will come from the Equal Rights Amendment are very similar to what, in some ways, to what all women experience. And when I say that, I'm talking about in the military specifically, there is a high rate of sexual assault and sexual violence, right? So the passage of the ERA will provide legal strengths in the court against gender-based violence. But it will also allow for promotions and accessibility to different kinds of jobs that has traditionally been shunned for women, as well as jobs that, are tied to higher pay. And so some of these issues, when we think about employment, when we think about promotions, these are the same kind of issues that a lot of women are experiencing.
Okay. I know that some states have their own equal rights amendments in their constitutions. Do you have a sense of why it would be more beneficial to have a federal one versus if every state had their own?
Yeah, because states, when you give all the power to the state, we think about the law in many ways. It can be interpreted in different ways. When you have a federal mandate, it is the law. You know what I mean? And so, it provides these kind of certain protections that are not left, to the state, or are not, left to interpretation. And that becomes, there's no restrictions there. That becomes important.
Right, because if it's federal, it's the supreme law of the land.
Absolutely.
Right. Here's a question. How does the ERA affect changing and fluid concepts of gender? Would the ERA really cover these, or is different legislation required?
That's a really good question. But I think because the ERA is really talking about protections on account of, gender and sex. I mean, that's in there too. That would be included. So as gender becomes fluid, and when I think about that question, I think about all of these movements. I mean, my work specifically is on the Black Panther Party, and that certainly was a conversation, gender fluidity internally within the organization. And a lot of these organizations still were like, the ERA would definitely benefit, and change lives, transform lives. So when we talk about gender fluidity, absolutely, I would say absolutely the ERA would benefit for that. And I think that's what Kimberly Crenshaw and Catherine McKinnon was doing when they went to change the language of the ERA. They were accounting for all of those intersections and for all of that diversity. And so they were making the language much more inclusive to speak to the needs of, folks today. So yes.
So it's your sense that the ERA would apply to, say, a trans woman?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
Let's see, here's a question and a comment. Thank you for lifting up the powerful life's work of these incredible Black women. Along with the ERA, are there other federal policies or legislation that's focused on issues that promote oppression, such as violent police practices, that would move the dial on intersectional issues for women of color?
Yes, yes. So that is a really good question. And there has been historically certain acts that have been put in place that work to support women of color. But as many activists have said, all the activists that I've looked at and more have said these acts are still not enough, right? So, even if we're talking about the Civil Rights Act, or if we're talking about the Voting Rights Act, or if we're talking about acts that are specifically, about police violence, some of the newer acts that's been passed. Many argue, and I would support that is still, those acts still does not override a constitutional amendment in support of equality, of full citizenship.
Right. Okay. Do you, I don't know if you know this or not, but do you know if a state that's already ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, can a state rescind that ratification?
Yeah, and so, that's a really tough question to answer. And I know this has come up when we look at other amendments as well. And, much of those, I should say, those changes or those kind of nuances, what the literature supports is that they really support when the ratification happens. So I see less about the state rescinding it, although it has happened. But I think that is still tied, or that is tied to these current debates. But let me say, I would not put anything past the ability with me saying that, of a state being able to do this. I mean, when we look at the history of the Equal Rights Amendment, 100 years later, and we still do not have it in the Constitution, it really wouldn't surprise me at all.
So you're saying if a state wanted to, they probably could rescind their ratification.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, here's a question. You said that you are researching women in the Black Panthers. Can you recommend a good book about that?
I actually could. Robin Spencer's The Revolution Has Come is a fabulous book. It gives an overview of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. I think it's a wonderful introductory text to the history, to the theory, to the internal conversations, to the community programs, to the international mobilization work that was happening in the Black Panther Party, as well as the changes and nuances that happened in the 16-year history of the organization. And so I think that's a fabulous book to start with. There is a huge body of literature on the Black Panther Party, but I think that book is excellent. There's also Alondra Nelson's Body and Soul, and her book looks at the history of the health programs of the Black Panther Party, the activism around sickle cell anemia, as well. So those two books are excellent ones to start with. I can think of others, Donna Murch's book, that really looks at migration, and also provides a history of the Black Panther Party. So there's many others, but those are some to start with as well.
And can you just give those two titles one more time?
Yes, and so it is Robin Spencer's The Revolution Has Come, and then the name is Alondra Nelson, and it's Body and Soul, and it looks at the health programs of the Black Panther Party. That's not the actual title, but I know Body and Soul is in the title.
Okay, great. And I think you told me that you are also writing a book on the Black Panther Party.
Yes, I am. I'm writing a biography on Erica Huggis. She was one of the longest serving women in the Black Panther Party. She was a political prisoner. She was director of the Black Panther Party's last community survival program, the Oakland Community School. She was a human rights activist. She was a poet. She was an artist in many ways. And my book really looks at the ways that she did what I call spiritual activism. And that is ways that she engaged the mind, body, and soul, the inner work that we need to heal ourselves, how she was able to marry that with her political activism. And so I use her as a case study to really articulate the critical nature of spiritual engagement and political activism. So we're living in a society that does not, that works, or I should say, that does not value Black and brown bodies. So what does it mean to do the work to really heal ourselves and heal our community and really do the work to live more as whole people while also engaging political activism on the ground?
What do you think she would say about the activism that's going on now, in particular Black Lives Matter?
Oh, she's a huge proponent of Black Lives Matter. And, I know for sure that she would be encouraging, she would be championing, she would be advocating for Black Lives Matter. I know she is in huge support of a lot of the work. When we look at Black Lives Matter today, I know that their roots or some of the previous groups or activists that the group has, or I should say, the movement really looks to are the leaders of the Black Panther Party. And they have actually built on the work of the Black Panther Party, their theory and praxis. And so, when I talk about Black Lives Matter and how they have a focus on gender, how they are about gender equity, how they are looking at, for example, when we talk about women and, what it means to, have your job and, you're employed, you're kind of trying to survive, if you will. And then you also have, your family that you're taking care of or what have you, and you're in a society that doesn't value what it means to balance all of this. And so, they took the 10-point program and platform in many ways and built on it and expanded on it. And really put intersectionality at the center of that. And so I know she would absolutely champion that.
That's great. I know that, in the history books and in the press, the Black Panther Party is basically portrayed as a terrorist group. And yet there was so much community service and community building and advocacy that went on within the group. And so the two images are very disparate.
Absolutely. And my work, looks to correct that. Like you said, when most people think about the Black Panther Party, they think of the leather jackets, they think of guns, they think of Black men. Black women oftentimes do not become part of the narrative that they think about. They think about the Black Panther Party as criminals. And I'm telling a different story about the Black Panther Party, one that involves healing, one that involves love for your community, one that really showcases the community work of the Black Panther Party and, you know, practices of self-care and community care. And so I'm hoping to really push back against that damaging narrative often see perpetuated in Hollywood representations or in popular culture, because that is indeed not the story of the Black Panther Party. When you talk to living members, they have a different story to tell. They have one that is much more nuanced. And so, you know, my book is really about healing, as was done by members, particularly through the lens of Erica Huggins.
I think it's a really important story to tell.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't see any more questions, but I want to thank you all for tuning in. I think this has been a really fantastic topic, and you shed a lot of light on it. So I really appreciate it and appreciate you joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Our next program is July 14th at 7 o'clock, and it will be with author Sylvia True talking about her book, Where Madness Lies. So I hope you can tune in for that. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a good night. Bye-bye. And we're off the air.